Long before modern borders, long before cities and nations, there was only ice, silence, and the instinct to survive. Tens of thousands of years ago, during the last ice age, a group of humans stood at the edge of a vast frozen land. Behind them was Siberia. Ahead of them, something unknown. A massive land bridge, what we now call the Bering Land Bridge, connected Asia to North America. It wasn't a planned journey. There were no maps, no destinations, just movement, just survival. Step by step, generation after generation, they crossed into a new world. The cold was brutal. The terrain was unforgiving, but they adapted. They hunted animals, followed migrating herds, and slowly began to spread across this unfamiliar land. Over time, they didn't just survive, they explored. Some moved along the western coasts. Others traveled deep into forests and across vast plains. Thousands of years passed, and these early people reached as far south as present-day Mexico, and even beyond into South America. What began as a migration became something much greater. As they settled in different regions, they developed unique ways of life. Different languages, different traditions, different cultures. They learned to grow crops like corn and squash. They raised animals for food. They hunted bison, deer, and fish using tools and techniques shaped by their environment. They built communities. Some even constructed massive earth mounds, centers of power, ceremony, and belief. These were not simple societies. They were complex, organized civilizations. In fact, some of their cities were as large and advanced as those in Europe and Asia at the same time. And all of this began with a journey across ice and uncertainty, a journey without knowing what lay ahead. Today, we call their descendants Native Americans, the indigenous people of the United States. But their story is not just about survival. It is about courage, adaptation, and the incredible human drive to explore the unknown. Because thousands of years ago, when they stepped onto that frozen bridge, they weren't just crossing into a new land. They were shaping the future of an entire continent. But the journey that didn't end when they crossed into a new land. It was only the beginning. As generations passed, these early people began to spread further and further across the vast continents of North and South America. Some followed the coastline, moving along the edges of the Pacific Ocean. Others ventured inland, through dense forests, across wide plains, and over towering mountains. Each step brought new challenges. Different climates, different animals, different ways to survive, and so they adapted. In the cold northern regions, they learned to endure harsh winters. In warmer lands, they discovered fertile soil and new sources of food. Slowly, over thousands of years, something incredible happened. They stopped simply moving and began to settle. Small groups grew into communities. Communities grew into tribes, and each tribe became unique. They developed their own languages, hundreds of them, their own traditions, their own ways of understanding the world. No longer just travelers, they became creators. They learned to farm, growing crops like corn and squash, foods that would later feed entire civilizations. They raised animals. They hunted with skill and precision. They fished using tools shaped by experience and knowledge passed down through generations. But more than that, they built something lasting: homes, villages, centers of life. In some regions, they even constructed massive earth mounds, structures that served as places of power, ceremony, and remembrance. These were not simple societies. They were complex, organized, and deeply connected to the land they lived on. From a single migration across ice, a rich and diverse world had taken shape, a world built not by chance, but by resilience, adaptation, and time. For thousands of years, this world grew in its own rhythm, until everything changed. In 1492, ships appeared on the horizon. They came from a distant place called Europe, and with them came a new chapter of history. At first, these encounters were moments of curiosity, two completely different worlds meeting for the very first time. But that moment didn't last. Soon, exploration turned into colonization. European settlers began arriving in greater numbers, especially in regions like Florida and along the Gulf Coast. They were not just exploring, they were claiming land that was already home to millions, and with them, they brought something far more dangerous than weapons: disease. Illnesses like measles, smallpox, and yellow fever spread rapidly. Diseases the Native Americans had never encountered before. Their bodies had no immunity. Entire communities were wiped out. What had once been a thriving population began to decline at an unimaginable rate. But the exchange between these two worlds wasn't one-sided. Animals, plants, and even insects crossed oceans, sometimes by accident, sometimes by intention. This moment in history is known as the Columbian Exchange. One of the most powerful changes came with the arrival of the horse. At first, they escaped into the wild. But over time, Native Americans learned to ride them, and everything changed. Horses transformed the way they hunted, the way they traveled, and even the way they fought. But despite adaptation, despite resilience, the balance had already shifted. Two worlds had met, and one of them would never be the same again. As time went on, the arrival of Europeans was no longer just an encounter. It became a struggle for land, for power, for survival. The new settlers were growing in number. They needed farmland, they needed space, and the land they wanted was already home to Native American nations. Tension slowly turned into conflict. When the American Revolution began, Native American tribes faced a difficult choice. Who should they support? Many chose to side with the British, not out of loyalty, but out of hope. Hope that if the British won, the expansion of American settlers might finally stop. But history took a different turn. The United States was born, and with it came an even stronger desire to expand westward. The new nation hungered for land. At first, the government tried to negotiate, signing treaties to buy Native American territories, but those agreements were often broken or ignored. Settlers kept moving forward, and Native Americans kept being pushed back. Some leaders believed Native Americans could be civilized, that they should abandon their traditions and adopt European ways of life. But behind those ideas was a deeper goal: control. In 1830, everything changed again. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a law that forced thousands of Native Americans to leave their ancestral lands. They were relocated to unfamiliar territories, far from their homes. The journey was long, brutal, and heartbreaking. Many died along the way. This tragic event became known as the Trail of Tears, and still, the conflicts did not end. As the United States continued to expand, Native American tribes resisted, fighting to protect what remained of their land, their culture, and their identity. But the pressure kept growing, and the cost was devastating. By the end of the 19th century, the wars had nearly come to an end, but peace did not mean justice. One of the final and most tragic moments came in 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre. On a cold winter day, U.S. cavalry forces opened fire, not just on warriors, but on women and children. It was more than a battle. It was a symbol of how far things had fallen. The resistance of Native American nations had been broken, their lands taken, their people displaced, their way of life forever changed. And yet, their story did not end there. Years later, during World War I, thousands of Native Americans stepped forward to serve in the U.S. military. Nearly 10,000 men enlisted, fighting for a country that had once taken so much from them. In 1919, those who served were granted U.S. citizenship. And in 1924, a new law changed everything: the Indian Citizenship Act. It officially recognized all Native Americans born in the United States as citizens of the nation. At last, they had the legal right to vote, to participate in government, to be part of the country's future. But reality was more complicated. In many places, Native Americans were still denied their rights. Barriers to voting, discrimination, silence, even with citizenship. Equality was not guaranteed. And even today, questions remain. How much power should the federal government have over Native American lands? What does true sovereignty mean? How can traditions and cultures be protected in a modern world? Because this story was never just about the past. It is still being written. A story of resilience, of identity, of a people who endured and continue to fight to be heard.